Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. I'm your host, Levi McCrary, and here with me is my co-host, McKenna Hudgens. Welcome to the first episode of our podcast, named the P3 Podcast. Today's topic for discussion is Atentar 1942. The game is about the German occupation of Prague in World War II.
The story focuses on finding out what happened to the point of view character's grandfather who was arrested during the war. The grandfather was arrested for protecting a friend of his who just so happened to be Jewish, which was a serious offense during the war because of Hitler's anti-Semitic movement. That's why, if someone was German and they were found out to be protecting Jews, they'd be arrested and sent away to a concentration camp. The characters of the game include the character you play as, your POV character, your grandmother, Ludmila Jelenkova, who you interview to find out the basic information about the night of that the grandfather was arrested. Understandably, she doesn't like to talk about it. Your grandfather, Ginger Jelinek, was arrested during World War II and is now hospitalized. The neighbor, Joseph Malik, who worked at the proletariat as a journalist for the newspaper, he did not support the Germans during the war.
Matthias Krager, the leader of the Prague resistance, who you interview for information he has on your grandfather, he was very standoffish about the subjects of the invasion and the attacks on the train station. A man named Jacob Hein, who your grandfather meets and befriends while in Auschwitz. They find water from a pipe in the building that they were forced to demolish as part of the labor force. They were both severely dehydrated, and finding the water helped them both to survive.
A woman named Marie Servenkova, who escaped a Russian concentration camp and after being caught and transferred to a German camp. She meets your grandfather, who he helps and befriends after recovering from the hospital after getting out of Auschwitz. Then there's your grandfather's Jewish friend, Egon Maris, who was using your grandfather's name for protection, which resulted in the grandfather getting arrested in the first place as a result of this. The friend thought the grandfather was dead.
The plot of the game starts out with the POV character getting a call from her mother telling her that she needs to help the grandmother who she has to help move, who's an elder woman at this time. Then the first thing, it starts the conversation with the grandfather over the radio. That they heard on the radio before the grandfather was arrested was the police commissioner getting assassinated by a man wearing a gray hat. This leads to the grandfather getting arrested by the Gestapo.
The grandmother didn't know why he got arrested. After this, you talk to the neighbor, Joseph Malik, who is very short with a point of view character and doesn't really answer the questions that we ask them, then just rudely shuts the door abruptly. After this, you return to the grandmother's house, and she allows you to look through the grandfather's belongings. This leads to the discovery of other characters that the grandfather knew.
That's how we meet Matthias and Marie. We figure out from Matthias, who was a part of the resistance, that the grandfather was not part of the resistance. He was also offering information about the Prague uprising during the interview with the POV character, while Marie talks about her life in the camp and how she escaped the camp after one of the guards was trying to get her to submit to his will. The relationship between her and the grandfather was very close, and he helped her settle something with the government.
After the war, her husband told her about the compensation she could get from her pain and suffering from the war. Shortly after that, it's revealed that Marie still receives birthday letters from Egon, your grandfather's friend, who, as it turns out, thought that the grandfather was dead for 59 years. So after the POV character informs Egon that he's alive, he sets up a rather touching reunion. Then the game ended.
The concept of the game was an investigative point-and-click game that's also got an educational storyline element. Most investigative games don't have much of an education element. The point of the game is to gather information and reach the desired outcome to be more informed about what happened to your grandfather during the point in history. The concept is also on the events on what happened in the Czech Republic during the Prague invasion that a bulk of the game is centered around.
This game really reminded me of a few anti-war films that are fairly popular in the film industry today. According to the JSTOR article, Experiences of Modern Warfare and the Crisis of Representation by Bernhard Haupthoff. Context of the author. Bernhard Haupthoff is a professor of German at New York University. He has published numerous things, most of them in German, which we can't pronounce. Quote, with a constant stream of films about the Vietnam War in the 1970s and 1980s, films which attracted millions of viewers the world over and seemed to give new significance to the cinema as a public space for collective memory, end quote. This quote is basically talking about how the cinema is being utilized as an avenue for historical interpretation that we see in the anti-war films today. Levi, can you think of a few that we've watched?
The only real anti-war films I've watched is this really weird Nazi Titanic movie I found on YouTube.
Wait, what?
I kid you not. There was a film on YouTube that was a Nazi version of the Titanic, made and filmed all in German during 1943. And there was all sorts of German paraphernalia in it. I only watched 5 minutes, but that's what I saw.
Was it good?
I didn't finish it, but from what I've heard from others who have watched the movie, it most certainly was not.
Would you want to watch the whole movie?
No, I wouldn't. I would rather watch the annoying minions and just go me again than watch that movie.
You don't like the minions?
They're annoying. They were cute in the first movie, but got worse as the series went on.
How could you hate on the minions?
To be fair, I also don't like Kung Fu Panda.
Okay, well that's fair. I don't like Kung Fu Panda either.
What don't you like about it? I just never really got into it.
It's just too cheesy. But to go back to our discussion, I was reminded of a couple anti-war films that I watched, such as Full Metal Jacket, Friendly Fire, Jarhead, Saving Private Ryan.
Makes me cry every time. That and War Horse.
That one makes me cry too.
By the way, full disclosure, I've never heard of Full Metal Jacket. I legit pictured a sequel to Full Metal Alchemist when you said it.
Oh, right, the anime?
Yeah, the anime. Which is sort of like what they did in the concentration camps, actually.
How so?
The father, who was a scientist, experimented on himself and his wife and daughter, which resulted in both of them becoming dog-like creatures.
Ew. But I see your point.
As for the historical accuracy of the game, I looked it up, and the characters of the game are real. And according to the game's website, Atentar1942.com, under Gameplay Features article, the game is based on historical research and based on real testimony. Yet the characters in the game and their stories are fictitious.
While the characters are fictional, most elements that create the story are historically accurate. For example, when Matthias Kretschkar mentions the Prague Uprising, this can be linked to the resurgence of Czechoslovakia as a whole. According to the JSTOR article, the Czechoslovak government in exile during World War II, written by Wojtek Masny. Context of the author. Wojtek Masny is an American historian of Czech descent, professor of political science and international relations, specializing in the history of the Cold War. Quote, Czechoslovakia had become extinct before the war began, and its restoration was not a foregone conclusion, even for some of Hitler's most steadfast opponents. Its reemergence in 1945 may therefore qualify as a strikingly successful achievement of its government in exile, end quote.
This proves that the resistance was successful in restoring a country's government to a better place than what it had been prior to the occupation.
That does beg the question, is this game a form of propaganda or no?
The game, not necessarily. But things in the game, absolutely. But there's a difference between one and the other. According to the JSTOR article, the trial of Herschel Grindspin, Anti-Jewish Policy in German Propaganda, 1938 to 1942, written by Alan E. Steinweiss.
Context of the author. Alan E. Steinweiss is an American historian and a professor at the University of Vermont, specializing in the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust.
On November On 7th of November 1938, the Jewish teenager Herschel Geinspin shot a German diplomat in Paris, providing pretext for the nationwide anti-Jewish violence known as Kristallnacht. Although Geinspin had acted on his own, the Nazi regime portrayed him as instrument of world Jewry.
This is an example of propaganda.
Because it was later dropped due to a fear of it being overshadowed by a rumor of homosexual liaison. I know that sounds like a bombshell, but that's legit how the article says it.
The graphics of the game use a mix of animated graphics for flashbacks, newsreels of surviving footage filmed during the war as proof to what people say during the interviews with your grandmother, the head of the resistance. A good portion of the game was live action actors that's mainly used when you conduct the interviews, which is also when a bulk of the point and click portions happen.
I'll admit the font that they use for the subtitles was hard to read in some points of the game, but that's probably due to the fact I was playing it on a phone, and so that probably affected my playing of the game as opposed to if I was playing on either the Nintendo Switch or a laptop.
The animated portions of the game were mainly used during flashbacks of the characters showing what they went through, like when we see the night the grandfather's apartment was raided during his arrest, when Marie escaped from the concentration camp and fled, but this is only part of the game. This leads us into the music and sound design of the game. Gave off a very intense and almost eerie atmosphere, using piano music at times and crackling and rustling, which built to already difficult topics that the characters are talking about. This is fitting because following World War II, the people who survived the German occupation were suffering what was known at the time as shell shock,
which is more commonly known nowadays as PTSD. And by using the music the way they did, it adds atmosphere, and with the above-mentioned footage of the Nazi occupation of Europe during the war, it gives you a sense of what life was like for people at the time who experienced the occupation. Now, for the most important part of the game, the gameplay, meaning how the game performs and handles as you go along the story. Personally, I thought some points of the game were fairly choppy.
Yeah, there wasn't really a flow to the game.
Exactly. Parts felt like they should have been done in different parts of the game and done differently than they were. For example, I kind of wish we had been introduced to Egon earlier in the game. This would have made the twist that Marie still gets letters from him bigger than, oh, hey, your grandfather, his friend, is the one that sends it to me. And then the end.
I felt like the game was really interesting from a historical standpoint, but I agree that the flow was hard to follow through parts of it. I even had to play the game a second time to be able to fully understand it.
Which is pretty bad for a game that at times is very fun to play, but other times is kind of dull and drags on. Which brings me to the next category. Critiques.
One of the critiques that I would have had for this game would be how the minigames were conducted. In order to gain coins from these minigames, you had to basically guess exactly what was going to happen in the game. If you guessed incorrectly, you would not gain any coins, which was crucial for repeating interviews, which I had to do a lot, and gaining more information.
I agree that the minigames were drawn on way too long, but my biggest critique, I would add, is why does repeating interviews cost money? No other game I've ever played makes you pay money to repeat the things that you missed.
To reiterate a previously mentioned point, as for the text, I would have used a different color for the speech text and the options during the mini games and the interviews. They are very hard to read when playing on a mobile phone. The game should be friendly to all users of